All right, well, greetings, everybody. My name is Lincoln Snyder, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Catholic Educational Association. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I would be doing this live, but if you're seeing this video, it means that I had a little medical appointment that got pushed. And so I am pre-recording this portion of the talk. I am hoping that I'll be able to join the rest of the conversation live as it continues. So thank you for bearing with me on that. So again, my name is Lincoln Snyder, and I have been president of the NCEA since July 1. I spent the previous 6.5 years as superintendent of Catholic schools in Sacramento, California. So as you can imagine, a lot of my work over the last year and a half has put me into contact with everything to do with COVID-19. Sacramento is a medium-sized diocese in terms of school enrollment. We have 38 elementary schools and 6 high schools across 11 counties. And that latter bit was a big factor in the busyness that was my life over the last year and a half. It is a big diocese geographically. It covers 21 counties, 43,000 square miles, 1 million Catholics within that territory. 11 of those counties have Catholic schools. And so that meant that I was in contact with 11 different county health officers, which I'll be talking about shortly. I really saw my role as superintendent of schools to keep our schools open and keep our schools safe during COVID-19. And we had a good amount of success on both points. And so I wanted to start off by talking about what that looked like. We proved we could do both things. Like most schools, in March of 2020, we transitioned overnight from in-person learning to distance learning. And we learned a lot about how to best serve students when they are learning from home, but it was really clear to us that there were a lot of benefits to offering in-person instruction. And we also started seeing that public health did have a number of convincing strategies for mitigating COVID as we returned to in-person instruction. So as we got ready to start the 2020-2021 school year, we had gotten a good sense over those ensuing months for those first months of COVID of what we were working with. And that was in terms of public health expectations, which changed rapidly and often, but broadly speaking, the nature of the disease itself. So in terms of public health, I dealt with the state, the California Department of Public Health, which followed CDC guidelines, but not always, and 11 different county health officers, all of whom are physicians and all of whom have their own opinions. So we needed a strategy for getting our kids back into school. So we took all of the best medical science we could get our hands on, and this included CDC studies, private studies, the CDPH recommendations, of course, and we worked with medical experts to create a master protocol for all of our elementary schools, and then a second one for our high schools. And California, like all states, operated a little bit differently than its neighbors. In California, as COVID spiked into late summer, the governor decided to delay the opening of school and posted some new guidelines in July. And so we actually found ourselves opening school and starting the school year in late July in 4 different counties. In the rest, we had to wait. And so the state in California created a waiver process for which our schools needed to apply. And each of the counties was responsible for meeting certain criteria and then approving a waiver from a school district. So this was a rather convoluted process. Data was different in every county. COVID was different in every county. And the county health officers had their own opinions. But the long and the short of it is, by September of 2020, we had our students back in school in the classroom, and that's K through 5, 6 through 8, and then our high schools came back in October. So that's just by way of background. On this call, I really wanted to talk more about how we learned about mitigating and preventing the spread of COVID and how we use the science to really inform what we did. Early on, it became clear that children were not efficient transmitters of COVID, and countries that stayed open, as in Europe, really did not have high levels of COVID transmission in the classroom. But this doesn't mean that they didn't do anything. They were layering up, and what the documents refer to as layers of mitigation. So as COVID-19 ramped up, we started layering on the same things too. We started with things like face covering, personal protective equipment, screening, and better classroom plans, creating distance within classrooms, and good hygiene. That got us through those first months of COVID with a very low incidence of people sick on campus, and actually no diagnosed cases of uh, people taking ill from another person in our schools. So those first several months back were good, but COVID is a ever evolving beast that demands humility. Talk more about that too in a moment. And so as COVID worsened again going into the fall, we found ourselves adopting new strategies too. We introduced the notion of preventive screening coming back from Thanksgiving break. It was really clear in California that because people were going to be socializing over Thanksgiving and family gatherings, those family gatherings were going to be the main source of transmission of COVID. And we were going to have to do something to make sure that our schools are a safe place to return to. So, COVID is one of those things that, especially in the early days, one assumed one would get in the market or get from a stranger or get at work, but people let their guard down around family, and that's still an issue today. We tend to be a little bit less vigilant with people we love. We can imagine the stranger giving us something, but we'd never get it from Aunt Edna at Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, we did see a lot of those cases. So when we introduced screening for our schools, it really put us over the top. We asked a lot of our families. All of our students 6th grade and up had to go for a weekend screening to be able to return to school that next Monday. So people were going to one of 5 screening sites that we set up. It was costing us $50,000 a week to operate these screening sites. High schoolers had to go twice a week if they wanted to be in school full time. But thanks to the screening, we identified dozens of community members coming back from each of the breaks that would have brought COVID onto campus. 9 schools that would have had to quarantine out of my 44 managed to stay open because we were really careful about screening. So we learned how to manage COVID. We only had a handful of documented cases of on-campus transmission. We did have quarantines, but I think that, and of course, people were constantly concerned about what of all these layers of protection we're doing to their kids. I mean, a lot of the greatest emotions were and still surround masking, for example. But at the end of the day, we were open and we were safe. And as we got into the spring or late winter, early spring, it became clear to us that the grand prize was going to be vaccination and getting the grownups in our communities vaccinated. So in December, as we saw that the vaccines were on the horizon, I was working behind the scenes with the policy committee that was in contact with the governor's office and the California Department of Public Health to figure out what vaccine policy was going to be for the grownups, for the teachers who and other on-campus educators who were, at least on our initial thoughts, going to be treated as essential personnel. Governor Newsom here in California was very clear that he wanted kids back in classrooms. And behind the scenes, as the vaccines came closer and closer to release, there was a big debate about whether or not teachers should be on that list. Some people did not want teachers included on that list. Of course, we did. Yes, most public school teachers were not in session and continued to educate via Zoom throughout most of the school year here in California. But our Catholic school teachers were in class, and we were very confident that we were following the will of the governor and CDPH and doing everything we could to educate students in school. So after a lot of politicking with the governor's office, we did get teachers included on that list. Not in the very first tier, tier 1A, but still within that first general tier, teachers were considered essential personnel and were included on the list for vaccination. So that meant that I needed to work with our county health offices. That's the way it was set up here in California, to make sure that the county health offices included our teachers in tiers for vaccination and open up the doors to get our teachers vaccinated. Over the winter, we ran volunteer clinics at church sites, at a high school and at a parish here in the Sacramento area for early tier 1 folks. These are mostly medical personnel. There were a lot of cheaters in those early waves of vaccination. A lot of people jumping the line or claiming to be essential personnel and weren't. And so I'm sure you'll remember the wrangling over that. But in the end, we learned how to run these clinics and how to support others in running these clinics. And so Governor Newsom announced that we could get our teachers vaccinated starting the week of February 16th. I called in all the favors I could to arrange for 4 regional clinics, and by February 20th, every teacher and faculty and staff in the Diocese of Sacramento had the opportunity to go to a vaccine clinic. I'm really proud of the fact that the vast majority of our teachers went along with this. We only had a handful who turned down vaccination, and it became an issue. I will tell you that for us here in California, the politicking around the issue, that the fact that teachers were going to be excluded in those first rounds for a while, and teachers were aware of this, made them feel very competitive and even eager to get that vaccine. We had promoted it from the beginning as a professional expectation that it's best for the kids to get vaccinated, and that it was the right thing to do. And so I communicated that expectation clearly and consistently. We also made it clear that it was going to make their lives better if they were to get vaccinated themselves, and we presented the data around that. Finally, I leaned on our principals, the site leaders that the teachers trusted, to make sure that everybody was signed up for one of those clinics, and we were having a follow-up conversation with the folks who declined. I also made sure that I was visibly present at the clinics. I didn't get the vaccine myself until in those early clinics until I qualified for it. And in California, vaccine clinic workers qualified if there was leftovers. And so when we were running those early clinics, I got a shot. And so I made 2 things clear. I waited my turn, but I also took it without fear, and it was the right thing to do. And then I was visibly present at the clinics for everybody as our teachers went through and got their vaccines. So that got us through the end of last school year. And I know that we all breathed a big sigh of relief. It was huge for me to know that no one was going to die on my watch. I can't tell you what a burden that is, to just always have that in the back of one's mind. But I felt really good coming off those clinics, and we operated through the end of the school year more or less successfully. We wound down the preventive screening because incidences were just very low. And again, our grown-ups were vaccinated. So that is the background on how we manage it. And now I'd like to fast forward to now, because suddenly COVID is changing on us, and it's again, front page news, and it's scary. Delta is scary. We see that Delta is causing COVID to again spread like wildfire in unvaccinated populations. And another change with the Delta variant is that kids seem to be more efficient transmitters of Delta than of the previous strains. So again, going back to school last school year, we knew that kids weren't efficient transmitters, and that proved to be true. That appears to be changing to some extent. And so in my new role, as we're looking to advise our superintendents in our schools across the country, we have 6,000 Catholic schools here nationally, and they're looking for guidance. Of course, response is still a local issue. Every state has its own policy. Every school principal and every superintendent really is relying upon their county and their local health office to really make the final determination of what they have to do. But here's what I've been telling people about the response to Delta and how we can best prepare for the return to the next school year. So first of all, don't think of Delta as more of COVID-19. Think of Delta as an illness called Delta. It really is responding very differently than earlier variants, and we have to be humble in viewing this latest variant. It is its own thing. However, there's good news. There is a great way to mitigate Delta, and it's called the vaccine for COVID-19. So we're really looking at 2 populations in the country right now, folks who are vaccinated and everyone else. And folks who have had the vaccine, as they're encountering Delta, really seem to be dealing with this as an endemic problem. So think of this for the vaccinated population as something like flu season. You're not free of the risk of catching Delta if you've had your shots. But 99.99% of the vaccinated population isn't dying of it. So this is something that we're going to have to deal with, and there is a risk of getting it, but odds are overwhelmingly in favor of you not dying of it. And that's huge. We've just mitigated the biggest risk. If you aren't vaccinated, however, you're still in a pandemic, and you're in a pandemic that's worse for you than ever before. And so, of course, we have different populations of people who aren't vaccinated. Some have an underlying medical issue and they simply can't. Some are children 12 and younger, and they don't have that choice. And some people are hesitant for whatever personal reason, and they're looking at or they're deferring their vaccination because of that hesitancy. So I really want to speak to this third group. as the question of why to get vaccinated. I think the most important thing for me is that we, as Christians, owe it to everyone else around us. I mean, beyond one's own health and one's concerns about one's own response to the vaccine, the Holy Father has made it very clear that vaccination is an act of mercy. And for this very reason, again, not everyone around us can get vaccinated. I know everyone's making a choice for themselves about this, but we do have an obligation to our fellow man, and especially to those kids under 12. They simply don't have a choice in the matter right now. Most kids who are getting sick right now are getting sick from an unvaccinated adult in their household. And so, again, they're getting it more easily, and they are at risk, especially if they're around unvaccinated grown-ups. How do we help people decide to get that vaccine? Well, I think that we've had years worth of data now that would support the idea of the vaccine being the right decision, but people aren't sold by data or charts or medical professionals. It's very clear that advice and expert advice only goes so far. What does seem to work is in changing hearts and minds about vaccination is that we're hearing more and more stories about people who hesitated in getting vaccinated and found themselves regretting that decision in the hospital or even worse on their deathbed. And I think that this comes back to the notion of us as human beings, as storytellers and people who respond to stories and not statistics. I think that we can all empathize more with that notion of the person who made the choice and regretted it more than we can empathize with a number. And I think more importantly, as we talk about empathy, I really ask this of folks, and even with my own family, how would you process hesitating on getting the vaccine and giving it to someone else when you had that choice? I think people are fearful for themselves, but most of us, as we do that examine of conscience, really fear what we might do to someone else even more than that. And so as you look around your own communities and you wonder, okay, how do we help people understand why the vaccine is important and overcome that fear? I think a lot of it is not talking about statistics and medical data, but it's really telling them a story about one person, someone who took ill and regretted it. Or maybe it's the story of the kids who want to go back to school and need that in-person instruction. Kids should be in school. And this is the last point I wanted to share before we go to discussion and the next speakers. Learning loss and the loss of social growth during distance learning are real. So students who were in person this year, of course, it was a bit of a chaotic year, but the more kids were in person, the less loss they experienced during that time. And this is time and this is learning that kids can never make back. And that is both academically and socially. We know that we can operate schools safely for our kids if everything else is in place. All of those different layers of mitigation, with vaccination being, of course, at the very top of that pyramid. And so as we look around our communities about what has to happen next and why it's important to get vaccinated, and of course, as an educator, I'm going to put the kids first. It's my training, but I think it's a very true point. We really do owe this obligation to our kids to make sure that they're protected and that they're able to enjoy safe in-person learning coming into the next year, despite the fact that COVID continues to challenge us. Final thought, we know that this is going to be a disease that's going to be with us for a long time. It will continue to evolve. The more people that get those shots, the more we can slow that down. So I think that when people are in a time of crisis, they look to leaders to help them see a way forward. And with you being on this call, it's just a sign that you're committed to being a servant leader in your community. So thank you for being that trusted person for the people you know and love around you as you try to help society deal with this greater challenge of COVID-19. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the conversation, and God bless.